Over the last hour, I've been watching some more speeches from the UN General Assembly, which I think is wrapped up now. But there's so many on both the UN's channel and also the DRM news source that I was talking about. I think it's based in Switzerland, but it's an international source. And there's also the replies and rights of replies, which deals with various conflicts such as India and Pakistan and Egypt and Eritrea over their dam dispute, which, contrary to what President Trump says, is not yet a full blown war that he has solved. Um, I want to just say a few more further things on the UN as I see it. I was watching Secretary General Antonio Guterres' speech the other day, about half an hour long, and he was talking about a lot of the challenges the UN faces. By the way, just for the record, I respect Antonio Guterres. I think he is in arguably the hardest job in the world, or one of the hardest jobs in the world. And, in that job, you're never going to please everyone. He was re elected, not every Secretary General is. For example, Boutros Ghali of Egypt wasn't re elected. Um, Guterres is now serving this end of his second term, and I think actually it will be next year we're going to get into the next Secretary General. I think it's an 8-year term, if my maths is correct. Anyway, amidst the challenges he was talking about, he did talk about some positive things over the last decade. So that would be the period since 2015. The world has seen more people getting access to electricity, more people getting access to the internet. Women's representation has improved. Child marriages have decreased. Um, so there is some positive. It's not all bad news in the world. But I think of what Giorgia Meloni of Italy said, that there are now 54 armed conflicts in the world, and they range from major wars like those in Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, to ongoing insurgencies of varying levels. Nevertheless, all violent conflicts. 54. That's actually the highest since World War Two. This kind of flies in the face of Steven Pinker's arguments that human beings are actually um, more inclined towards peace. And for a while, the notion was that since the end of the Cold War, the number of armed conflicts has actually decreased. But right now in the world today, we see a lot of trigger points, and we see major conflicts that could get into even worse situations. So it's difficult right now, honestly, to say that the world is in a good place. The world's a big place, though. And it's worth bearing in mind that even at the height of World War Two, not every single part of the world was in armed conflict. For example, in World War Two, most of South America didn't actually see any active fighting in that conflict, although they were aligned one way or another. Most of World War Two was fought in Europe and Asia and North Africa. Um, the presence of nuclear weapons in the world today would obviously complicate matters if there was to be a third world war, but we've seen many international incidents where that has been speculated and never happened. From the Cuban Missile Crisis to the tensions of 1983 to numerous international incidents since then. For instance, the shootdown of the Russian jet over Turkey in 2015. That was a tense situation but never escalated. The invasion of Ukraine was a major geopolitical situation that, so far, as much as it's a major issue, is not a global war. But my sort of open thought here is, how can the UN still function in 2025? Will it still be there on the 100th anniversary in 2045? It has lasted a lot longer than the League of Nations, which, as William Ruto of Kenya pointed out, was why, in part, the UN was set up, because of the failure of the League of Nations. Um, the speeches I watched were a combination of praise for the UN and criticism of the UN, which kind of summarises the world itself. The world's never all good or all bad. Clearly, there is a lot of cynicism about the UN, and trust has been lost, for example, with abuses of power by UN peacekeepers who were once, revered. the Blue Helmets. We've also seen missions like, for example, the Kenyan force in Haiti. There was another atrocity in Haiti. That's one of the conflicts in the world that shouldn't be ignored. 8 children apparently died in a drone strike. You know, it really is a war. There's no point calling it just a gang conflict. That is a war. May as well call it what it is. Um, and we've seen new conflicts breaking up around the world. Much of the African continent is at war, and often it's countries that have seen abundant war before. Sudan, for example, went through two very costly civil wars. The First Sudanese Civil War, 1955 to 1971, the Second Sudanese Civil War, 1983 to 2005, and this could be called its third civil war. It's also proven to be very, very costly. Ethiopia has numerous bloody conflicts going on. Somalia is far from settled. Yemen is far from settled. So although Gaza and Ukraine are the two that get the most attention, there are other wars going on in the world. But how can the UN function when there's so many contradictions? I mean, one of the big blaring things is about the balance of power. You know, I come from the UK. The UK is a powerful country, and we have, like other European countries, an imperial legacy. So there's that the shadow of that and how we deal with that in the modern world. Um, I'm patriotic enough to say that I don't think we should always deal with foreign relations based on imperial guilt. I do believe that, but I mean, I think of the move that Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali have made in a rebuke to France by breaking away from cooperation with France and also breaking away from the International Criminal Court because they say it rewards criminality. There may be some valid grievances, but the bit that gets me about what um, those countries are saying is we're rejecting neocolonialism, okay, but why then accept Russian neocolonialism? There's a real contradiction in saying we're rejecting European neocolonialism, but we're fine with Russian neocolonialism, and China definitely has interest in that part of the world. So that just seems, if you want to be truly independent, why not reject Russia as well? You know, when you see Russian flags being waved on the streets of Bamako or Niamey or Ouagadougou, then it raises questions about what's really going on there. I mean, it's certainly not independence because they're effectively being used as puppets for the Russian Federation. Um, and what I would respectfully say to Malians or Nigerians or Burkinabe people is you talk about human rights abuses and you talk about France's role in that part of the world. Well, if that's your concern, what about what Russia's doing in Ukraine? It may seem a long way from you, but Russia is not a liberator. I mean, Russia's acting in a neo-colonialist way as well. So if you want to be truly independent, then be independent. Don't look to Russia. Um, the UN Security Council, as it stands in 2025, has 5 permanent members: the United States, the Russian Federation, China, the UK, and France. Now, I'm proud of the fact that my country is in that powerful bloc, but I think it should expand. I mean, for a long time now, India's been trying to get a position there. India is now the world's most populous country. I don't agree with all of India's positions. I don't trust India when it comes to Russia. I don't trust their so-called neutrality. Nevertheless, it is a major power. Maybe it's about time that India was in the Permanent Security Council. Germany and Japan, surely it is time that their wartime guilt or the wartime past is not used as a stumbling block. And I'm not suggesting that's the only reason, but they're two of the world's biggest economies. It seems strange that they wouldn't be on the Permanent Security Council. And of course, this is all up to the legislatures of each country to determine as well. But having just 5 countries on that, when we have a world of approximately 190 countries, seems definitely elitist in an unhelpful way. There has long been a call for a permanent seat by Africa, but of course, as we know, Africa is a continent. I understand the inclinations to that. My question would be, like for example to the African Union, who gets that seat? Would it be the African Union, or would it be rotating between countries? And then who gets it? Would it be Nigeria, Egypt, Ethiopia? You know, this idea of African brotherhood's all well and good, but African countries have plenty of disputes among themselves. So having a permanent African seat, who gets to speak for the whole of Africa? It would have to be rotationary. And then if we're really talking about global representation, what about Latin America? Should there not be a permanent seat for Latin America, i.e. rotated for Brazil, Colombia, Mexico? What about those countries? So I do actually think that it should expand, but the question is who. And then you get the valid criticism, which is that the five permanent members very, very, very rarely agree on anything, because Russia and China are usually in one camp, Britain, France, and the United States on the other. So getting the UN to agree on almost anything is a problem. I will say this: one of the reasons I'm so deeply critical of Donald Trump is because I think he's really, really damaging Western credibility now. The UK speaks for itself, France speaks for itself, Canada speaks for itself, but very often when people look at the West, they think of its most powerful country, the United States. Donald Trump made it clear what he thinks of the UN. He was whining about the escalator not working. He was whining about the teleprompter and all the rest of it. He spoke a lot longer than his allocated slot. For all his talk about winning the Nobel Peace Prize, many in Central America see Trump as imperialistic. Now, regarding the Venezuela situation, I happen to think Maduro is a thug who has destroyed his country. Nevertheless, any sort of American military intervention, you'd get a lot of left-wing leaders in that part of the world would feel compelled to condemn Trump. Even if they don't necessarily like Nicolas Maduro, they'll feel compelled to condemn Trump, otherwise they'll be seen as apologists for American colonialism, as they would see it. So I'm thinking of someone like Gustavo Petro, who was apparently, his own visa was renounced in New York City. We're talking here about an elected head of state of a country, not some terrorist, not some criminal, an elected head of state of a country. Although I should be careful how I say that. You know, former President Sarkozy of France has just been indicted and is going to prison. Trump is a criminal. Um, Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines has been indicted by the International Criminal Court. But yeah, I digress. So definitely the way Donald Trump has approached international affairs, I think, has not helped give the West a good image. Because very often people look at the West, they look at the United States. This absurd thing about the US Labour Secretaries announcing $100,000 for a working visa, it's madness. Who the hell can afford $100,000? It's insanity to me. And Trump is such a disruptor. You know, I think he really is damaging the West. I think it's why Europe needs to step up a lot more, for sure, and why we need to work closely with our allies. I mean, Anthony Albanese of Australia addressed the Labour Party conference today in Liverpool. I welcome that, but I just think Donald Trump might well be seen as the president who presided over American decline. For all MAGA likes to throw that at Joe Biden, it's not Joe Biden that pulled out of international frameworks and international agreements. It's Donald Trump. It's embarrassing. I mean, if I was American, I'd be embarrassed right now. He's not making America great again. He's making America deeply unpopular in many, many parts of the world. Maybe MAGA people just don't care, but that's fine. They can say the hell with the rest of the world, but in the long run, it will weaken America. It will. Okay, so I'm sort of the view, if you want to say the UN is a total failure and it's a joke and all the rest of it, my simple question is, what do you replace it with? What do you replace it with? You know, human civilization, human society has evolved to the point where there is international frameworks, there are international agreements, there is international cooperation. Do we go back to a point of a pre-industrial, hell, even pre-agricultural age, where people are just hunter-gatherers on their own? The world is interconnected. That's just the reality. And people could talk about globalists all they want, but the world is interconnected. That's the reality of it. So long as it is, it makes total sense to have some sort of international body where countries can have a voice, whether they be small countries like Pacific Island nations or superpowers like China and the United States. I think that's so. I'm not anti-UN. I do think the UN needs some serious reforms. There's serious contradictions. For example, having severe human rights abusers on the human rights body is absurd. Countries practicing hypocrisy, showing contempt for the international norms, whether it be Russia or the United States or China, um, and saying one thing and doing another, as has been pointed out. For example, what Russia says and what it does are two different things. Russia talks about peace at the UN whilst they fire drones into Ukrainian civilians. So the UN is, you're never ever going to get a situation where 194 plus countries totally agree. But I just don't think that abolishing it is the right approach, because the obvious question is, what do you replace it with? And a lot of the principles of the UN are very worthy ones. And it is true that since 1945 there hasn't been a global war. It's very easy to look in despair and say the world's a mess and it's all going to hell, but there hasn't actually been a global war. Even with the aggression we see in the world, with armed conflicts between long-standing rivals, between, you know, the superpowers squaring off. I think we're in a new Cold War, I've said that before, but we're not yet in a world war. And frankly, it is the UN that has prevented that from happening. Without the UN, it's very, very conceivable that some of these tensions would have escalated. Really. Without the UN, there wouldn't have been mediation, there wouldn't have been the sort of diplomacy that we've seen from the UN. So I don't think it's all bad. And I think it's a mistake to just denounce it in total. But I do think there's dangerous contradictions in the UN. I think there is a cause for greater representation, particularly with the Permanent Security Council. Yes, there's a rotationary Security Council, but the Permanent Security Council probably does need to increase from 5 member states. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what country you're from and what's your views on your country. I'm from the UK. We remain quite a significant power. We have lost our superpower status, but we're not a small country. And we are on the Permanent Security Council. I'm proud of that, but I see where the UN has issues. Let me know your thoughts.